Good evening, everybody, and welcome to our February Acting for Justice event. My name is Jack Jezreel, and I'm part of the leadership team of JustFaith Ministries, and I'm joined by my colleague Heidi Villaluz, tonight's co-host, and we're delighted that you could join us. So let's begin our program this evening with prayer. These words come to us from Martin Niemöller and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Martin Niemöller was, as many of you know, a German theologian and a Lutheran pastor who lived at the time of the Nazi rise to power. Early in his pastoral career, he was a strong supporter of Hitler, even declaring him, and I quote, an instrument of God. Later, after spending time in a concentration camp for protesting Hitler's takeover of the churches, he had a profound change of heart and spent the latter part of his life acknowledging the capitulation of the churches to the Nazi agenda. And these are his important and familiar words, and I ask that you listen to them in a prayerful place. First, they came for the communists, and I did not speak out because I was not a communist. Then they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. And then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. And then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. And then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. And then to these words from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. We are now faced with the fact, my friends, that tomorrow is today. We are confronted with the fierce urgency of now. In this unfolding conundrum of life and history, there is such a thing as being too late. Procrastination is still the thief of time. Life often leaves us standing bare, naked, and dejected with a lost opportunity. And over the bleached bones and jumbled residues of numerous civilizations are written the prophetic words, too late. So now let us begin. Now let us rededicate ourselves to the long and bitter but beautiful struggle for a new world. Amen. Now Heidi will share a few logistics about tonight's gathering.
Thanks, Jack. And it's so good to see so many of you, some new faces, some returning faces. And if you can stay with us for the whole evening, we're so glad. If you can't and you have to hop off early, know that the event is also being recorded. We'll send that recording out for yourself, or if you'd like to share the event with others who couldn't be here with us, or who you really feel like should hear these messages. And so know that you'll receive that in your inbox by Monday morning, along with any resources that we might be linking or referring to the event. During the course of the presentation, we invite you to we'll collect your Q&A questions. We'll have a time of Q&A at the very end of the session. And so we invite you to drop all of those into the chat. Jack and I will collect them. If you'd like to drop them into the group chat, or you can send them individually in private messages to Jack or myself, and then we'll raise those aloud to Daniel. And just for the convenience and of everybody gathered, because there's so many of us, and it's so wonderful to have so many of us gathered on the call, we're going to ask everyone to remain muted, and we'll do the Q&A mainly through the chat, and then Jack and I will raise those questions at, toward the end of the presentation. And then as the evening closes, we'll have a time of prayer at the conclusion of it. And before we jump into the presentation, we just also want to thank everyone who's donated and continues to donate to make these Acting for Justice webinars possible. We're going to keep bringing them to you monthly, so to bring the issues that are on your hearts to the public discourse in a compassionate and Christian way. And so I'll hand it back to Jack, who's going to introduce our featured speaker this month.
Thanks, Heidi. It's my pleasure to introduce you to tonight's presenter. Daniel Hunter is an author and a trainer and strategist for social movements. Many of you who have participated in our programs know Daniel through his books, both the Climate Resistance Handbook and Building a Movement to End the New Jim Crow have accompanied hundreds of Just Faith participants in the work of social change. Daniel also brings global experience. He has led trainings for ethnic minorities in Burma, pastors in Sierra Leone, and independence activists in Northeast India. He has worked with communities worldwide to tackle environmental, racial, and economic injustices, empowering people to take action and build resilience. For many across the nation, Daniel has been a guiding light in these trying times. His viral article, 10 Ways to Be Prepared and Grounded Now That Trump Has Won, was shared rapidly across the national activist scene on the evening of the election, helping people navigate the challenges of movement building under the current now Trump administration. And most recently, Daniel published a choose your own adventure book called What If Trump Wins? And finally, I would just like to mention Just Faith's gratitude to the contributions of the larger Hunter family, which includes Daniel's father, Bob, who serves as a member of our board of directors. Daniel, we are delighted to have you with us. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate the chance to speak to all of you. I just want to just acknowledge we're in a lot of different shapes right now. And so it's a period of time in which when people ask me, how are you doing? It feels like a trick question. And I'm like, give me an easier one than that one. But I just want to acknowledge we're in a lot of different places. And I think one of the things that's most important to do when we're in a lot of places is acknowledge there's a lot of contradictions and inside of ourselves, a lot of shifting, a lot of growing in this space. And so I think holding contradiction includes the fact that both there's a contradiction of we want someone to tell us what to do, and also we are extremely wise and have all the answers ourselves. That there's a contradiction of we're desperately in terrible shape and we're also doing fine and holding it together and doing a great job. That we're both folks who are feeling sad and defeated, and we're also people who come from a legacy of strength and who have elders and ancestors who've made it through really tough times. So I just want to honor all of the parts of you wherever you're showing up for this evening conversation. I really appreciate the opening prayer, and it reminded me of a meme that maybe some of you have seen, which is they came for trans people, and even though I'm cis, I spoke right up because I know the rest of that poem. And I think of that as another guiding inspiration for us for tonight. So I want to back up just a little bit about sort of how I just started thinking about this question of autocracy and where we are. And it came about a year ago even when I began realizing that it looked very possible that Trump might win. And one of the things that occurred to me at the time was after Trump won the first time, people spent a lot of time in a lot of shock. Some people spent days in shock. Some people spent weeks in shock, fine. Some people spent months and years in shock. And one of the aspects of the shock was continuing to, I can't believe that thing. And it became very challenging for people to be engaged during that time where people just kept being confused about, I can't believe this other thing, or I can't accept, even though he had said many of those things were things that he was planning on doing. And so I was thinking we really do need to, as much as possible, accelerate, if Trump does win, accelerate our ability to be in some acceptance, not acceptance in the sense of okayness, but acceptance in the sense of this is really happening. And the things that we perceive happening really are. And so then I began, as Jack mentioned, I began writing this book, which is what would you do if Trump wins, which is a choose your own adventure. And the reason for choose your own adventure was rather than spending a lot of time debating exactly what might happen, to just explore. It could go this way, it could go this way, it could go sideways. Acknowledging there's a great deal of uncertainty. And I think we are now experiencing that great deal of uncertainty. How it's been a very fast couple of weeks. How much will it stay at that rate? How much will it continue, et cetera, et cetera? And there's some things we know, and I want to point out some things that I feel like I know, even though I'm also living with this uncertainty too. But I also just wanted to invite people into the question, what do you want to do? If you'll notice, there's a lot of articles and a lot of things out there about what is happening and what's bad out there. And I can join, I can get into the diagnosis and the analysis with everybody. And there's a lot less written, even from some of our best thinkers, there's a lot less written about what can we do. And I think that's a real detriment, because what it does is it continues to make it something out there. And there's a lot of steps that are important for us to do. So I want to focus a little bit more on that tonight, just sort of what are the different pieces for us to put into place. So I'm going to use my article as a kind of guiding way for me to hold the conversation tonight. It's easier for me because my brain, just honestly, my brain is doing this a little bit. I can imagine some of you might join me on that. And so it'll help focus me a little bit. But I do want to integrate some of the things that we're learning as we're watching this particular regime unfold. I do also want to tell a story. And I want to open with a story just to bring us into some of the possibility that I think is out there. And I don't do this for most groups. I do a lot of secular presentations. But for a faith-based group, I really want to honor something that I think is underneath some of this. So my dad, I don't even think has heard this story. So this is my coming out moment around something here. So right after Trump won, people were feeling very anxious. And there's a great deal of anxiety. And so, as Jack mentioned, I wrote an article. And one of the first things I told people in the article is to trust yourself. I had expected when I first wrote this article, I thought I would write about some of the different strategic lessons. I'd learned lessons from how people have fought autocracies in different parts of the globe. But when I asked people in Turkey, what do people need to know? When I asked people in Hungary, what do the people need to know? When I asked people in variety of different countries living under autocracies, what do we need to know? Almost all of them spoke primarily about the psychological impact. The thing they said the most is you really have to protect yourself, because there's an incredible amount of gaslighting. There's an incredible amount of pressure to stay small, to get your head down, to conform to the politics of the time, to adjust your dreams, to shrink down the person that you are, to become someone who's rounded on your edges, to become someone who's absorbing all of the fear, to absorb all of the negative energy, to someone who doesn't rebound anymore, but someone just does this, to get tight in your belly. I mean, people said that was almost everything people said. 80% of what people said is about that first. And so I realized that's the place to really start, which is first to honor your own insides. Whatever you're feeling as true, whatever you're feeling as something to acknowledge and sort with. And so the first advice that I told people is to trust yourself. And a lot of that is about and I mean something very specific here. I don't mean trust yourself in the sense of whatever you believe happens to be true. I don't believe that, because we don't know. There's uncertainty. But I mean trust in the sense of that inner guide, that inner wisdom. And so I surprised myself how this unfolded, because I was being interviewed by several reporters. So I got interviewed by a reporter from Vox News, Vox with a V. And they asked me, they were very shaken themselves. And they asked me a tough question. What should we do? And I said, I don't know everything, but here's the pieces I know. And eventually they asked a very tricky, sort of loaded question, as reporters can, where they asked something like, how do you hope that Trump supporters will get their comeuppance in the next administration? Like, how do you hope that they will suffer and learn their lesson? Just a brutal question, right? By its framing and approach and everything. So I knew enough to not jump into not to try to dive right into it, to like take a step back and try to figure out how I would ask the question. And I took a moment and asked myself, what's the most true for me in that moment? And so I just paused and said what felt true for me. And you know those moments when you speak something far faster than you know something to be true, you had that experience where you watch something come out and your brain hasn't processed it. So I came out saying I'm Quaker. For those of you who don't know me, I've never identified as Quaker before. Welling, who's on the call, I've never identified as Quaker in my entire life. But I said I'm Quaker. And what that means is I believe there's that of God within every person. And what that means is that in this time ahead, what we need more than anything else is for each person to get greater access to the divine and to be more connected. Again, you don't know me that well, but that is a surprising answer for me. In part because it's not a secular approach to taking on the question. And also because I'm not identifying as Quaker, even though the latter parts really do fit. They do fit in how I feel and how I view the world, how I understand it. So I thought it was a blip. And then I got another interview the next day with Truth Out magazine. And they asked another version of that same question. How do you hope that Trump supporters will suffer in the time ahead? And oh, geez. But I had a chance to think about it. And, I gave one off the top answer and I surprised myself. So I'll come up with something better this time. And I answered in a surprising way, which was, look, I'm Quaker. So what that means is that I believe that there's that of God within every person. And what that means is that in the time ahead, I believe that each one of us needs to get greater access to the divine in order to navigate for the times ahead so that we can all be greater and wiser. I mention this story because I think there's several things happening. And I wanted to speak to, I will go into the politics. But there's also something about the times that's inviting and creating faith opportunity. There's doorways open. As people who have been despairing, people who are shattered, people in broken communities, I'll say it a different way, which is authoritarianism. One aspect of authoritarianism is the degree to which people feel disconnected from other people and distrustful and live in a great time of uncertainty. And human beings do not do well with uncertainty. And so when we live around so much uncertainty, for example, big questions that have not been resolved, that are growing in their tension, the wealth divide, the wealth inequality, that gap is getting bigger and bigger and bigger again. Climate change, which is this monstrous sized problem that no one has any single answer to, and which the elites have no articulated answer that's believable about how they're going to achieve this thing. These create anxieties within people, whether they believe in climate change or however they come at it, whether they believe in whatever. This is a time in which people feel such great anxiety, such great uncertainty, such great distrust that there are answers. And so one way that you can resolve that uncertainty is by looking to someone who says, I am certain, follow me. And that's a voice that speaks to people. And that's a voice that speaks in the language of dictatorialness, in the language of a tyrant, in the language of authoritarianism, in the language of, I will do whatever I want, but it will be right and you will be better for it. And whether people believe it or not, there's an attraction about certainty, an attraction of at least you will tell me we can get out of this uncertainty that I'm living in. And then there's another way to deal with the uncertainty. And that's the spiritual path that brings us closer to God, that brings us closer to the divine. And so at a spiritual level, I think we are in a moment of great spiritual warfare about which direction do we head towards. Do we head in the direction of trusting in a human who says, I have all the answers? Or do we trust in something that's greater than our own minds and our own selves? So I frame that here amongst this group, that I think that's underneath a lot of this. And so I will walk through kind of the 10 steps, but I wanted to frame sort of our conversation, I think, in that way, because I think it gives a way to understand and reflect on where we are in a way that I don't see in the New York Times or Washington Post in this moment. Okay, so I want to walk through some of these different pieces. Let's see which way okay, I'm pointing over here. Great. So can you see this over here? I'm trying, it keeps pointing me the wrong direction. So step one, trust yourself. So this is about acknowledgement, like I said, about where you are and sort of the own uncertainty. And the second step is to find others that you trust, to build your connection. So I work with a lot of activist organizations, and we use a language of to build your affinity group, and to find people who you are connected to, who you're with, folks who you love and who trust you, and you trust and you love. And that means not only people who you agree with, but people who you can wrestle with. So not just folks who sort of yes to anything that you think is a good idea, but people who really will work with you, maybe move in action with you. So during this time, that's been my primary instinct with everyone who I talk with who says to me, I don't know what to do. And I say, well, have you first gotten with some other people? And we've created this thing called Minute of Us, where every Wednesday at 12:53 p.m., we invite people to gather together in a moment of silence and prayer to be together in community to just reflect on the harms that are being caused. And what I've noticed is people who are not yet in motion, people who are still frozen, often need to just be with other people and to take some breaths within their own selves. Which is connected very much with number 3, which is grief. And the US is not fantastic at grief. If I go online in my circles, there's a lot of rage, there's a lot of frustration, there's a lot of this shouldn't be, but the actual outpouring of grief, where people almost every day I get a good cry in about the news, to take it in. Because among other things, grief is a doorway to acceptance. That way that I was saying, people need to accept what's happening here, the way that Trump is moving, the harms that are being caused, the great destruction that we're seeing of many norms and values and things that we care about. Those things need to be grieved in order to be owned and moved through, so that we're not just in a reactionary state. And one of the things that authoritarians do is they generate so much chaos that it becomes difficult to grieve. So folks may be familiar with places where dictators would slaughter people and then interrupt the funerals. South Africa, it was such a tendency. They would then interrupt the funeral itself to do repression, because that's a source to interrupt people's grief cycles, and the way that that becomes a community building operation. So in the article, I talk about it as a strategic error for people who aren't feelings people. If you're not a feelings person, it's a strategic error on our parts to not give ourselves the space to do some of that grief. And it's up against the culture in many ways. So we get with some other people, we look around, feel some of our feelings, and then we begin to move into action. And it starts by focusing on something. That's a way to say it, how to say it even a smarter way. It's about realizing we can't do everything, so we do our part. And so here I reminded of my mom had a little poster on her wall that had that quote from Reinhold Niebuhr, God grant me the serenity to accept the things that I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. And it wasn't until while I was doing research for all of this that I learned that prayer ascribed to him came out while he was watching the rise of the Nazi regime. And that, in fact, that makes it so much more important for me to hold on to, because I see all these bad things out there and realize I don't have the capacity to change all of them or to work on all of them. And that creates a story where I get overwhelmed. And so very quickly, the size of the problem causes me to feel overwhelmed. And again, what do all these people who fought autocracies tell me? They all tell me one of the biggest things is you have to be able to stay in motion, because political space the ability to act shrinks when people don't use it. So last Wednesday, people across the country went into the streets and protested, had a great experience for it. There's energy, momentum, etc. And there's also fear that people had. People wondered, can we protest in a Trump era, or will we just get beat up by the police? And one way we can act is then we shrink and we don't do it. And the other way is we go towards it and we continue to be in some amount of expansion. So part of that is then thinking, what are the different ways that I have in the past done political space that I want to keep doing, but also to give ourselves some permission that whatever I want to do, whatever I do, whatever I contribute towards will not be sufficient on my own. And so that feeling inside of me that I have every morning, afternoon and evening these days, just to be honest, the feeling that I have that that's not enough, the work I'm doing is not enough, is really in many ways sort of created by this kind of superhero notion. You watch any action hero, any action film, and you'll see a movie about someone who it looks like nothing can be done. And then at the last minute, the hero comes through, right? Iron Man or Batman or whoever it is, Wonder Woman, in the last 10 minutes of the film, finishes it, fixes it all together, and we win. Which, great news for everyone that in the history of the world, of any big problem, that has never been solved by one person, ever. Any big problem has always been solved by a society moving, and a movement in motion, groups of typically many, many people. Just thinking about the civil rights movement, for those of us who can recall or bring that to mind, the number of people, the number of individuals who did many, many things. People who went to jail, people who risked arrest, people who supported those people who risked arrest by tending to their family members, the people who made food for all these gatherings, the people who hosted people in their houses, the people who wrote literature, the people who sang and created songs, the people who prayed for people, the people who led funerals for people who had been assassinated and killed, the people who organized people through phone calls and conversations, the people who figured out how do they create taxi rides for folks in the Montgomery bus boycott, and on and on and on and on. There are an abundant number of roles. We cannot do it all. We find our path. And here I started to try to articulate some of the different pathways that there are for resistance. And there are sort of 4 different streams that I began to find. And I want to pause here before going right into the streams by just saying, we're already seeing those in motion right now. So I'll explain those pathways by talking about how we're seeing them if we're paying attention. So protecting people are that body of work so I'll go through the 4 paths. So protecting people is the first one. Actually, okay. Wait, I'm in the way now. Okay, so we're going to go just these 4 different ways of what we do. So one way, one path is those of protecting people. So the folks who are getting harmed immediately. So this evening, one person texted me and said, if you know people in DC, we're opening homes for all the US aid workers who are now flooding back into DC with no homes, no, whatever. I got another text from a friend who is organizing with the New Sanctuary movement here in Philadelphia, where what they do is they're supporting all the many people who are immigrants who are either under threat of deportation or are worried about ICE. The fear that's gripping that community has gotten very hot. And so they're telling me that many people are scared to go outside. And so they're organizing food and ways to make sure that people are being taken care of and being touched base with. That whole body of protecting people, it's one of the roles that folks in religious communities have played faith communities have played such a critical role for so many for so long. The second one, going downwards, is defending civic institutions. So these are folks who are working on safeguarding the institutions that already exist and protecting elections, protecting the EPA, protecting. Right now, we're watching federal workers as a central pillar that are being targeted. And one of the things that happens is that an autocracy wants to undermine those civic institutions, because an autocracy, by its nature, it's about pulling as much as possible, pulling all of these different, getting as much control centralized to them as possible. And so like each night when I can't go to sleep, I've been reading on Reddit the Fed workers who are self-organizing. And if you haven't caught, there's some great things there. There's one of the most viral pieces was someone who said that they had thought that they were going to quit when the administration came in, and then they saw this incredible letter, the so-called buyout, that was just so demeaning and just so disrespectful. And they said, I'm not going to quit anymore. In fact, I think this is going to rebound the other direction. And I'm encouraging everybody to dig your heels in, hold the line. And other people then jump in the thread saying, that's absolutely right. I am petty. I eat pettiness for brunch, and I'm going to stay in as long as possible. And on and on and on. And it's workers pumping each other up, giving support to each other to say, we're not going to let this institution just fold. And instead, we're going to hold the line. And that means different things, right? So that will mean sometimes they'll be open about that. Sometimes they'll be silent. We will find, I think historians, my mom is a historian, and so I'm thoughtful about how historians in 10 years, I think, will start to piece out who was actually a collaborator and who was actually just staying inside but resisting it, making it really go slow. So we have support to do. We have honor, we have thanks, we have ways that we want to continue to boost those folks who are in that role. And then disrupting and disobeying. That's what I've often historically thought I was, and that's not thought I was, have been. People who are doing strategic disobedience, protesting policy, people who are in the streets, people who are actively saying we need to do mass noncompliance, people who are saying we need to break the law when the law is wrong, people who are saying we need to get in the gears of the system. Sometimes that's overt and confrontational. Sometimes that's exposing information. Most recently, some of you may have just caught this news that one of the folks who was in Elon Musk's inner crew got exposed. They got their name, and then they got hold of their past social media accounts where they said awful things. They said, I hope Gaza and Israel both get wiped off the planet. They say that I'm trying to get these right. They make me angry, so I don't remember the exact words, but something along the lines of, you couldn't pay me enough money to marry someone outside of my ethnicity, and on and on. Awful things, absolutely awful things. And in response to that getting exposed, they've now quit. So those are, at this stage, we're seeing there'll be a lot of symbolic stuff that will go on, a lot of protests, marches, rallies, but those shift in autocracies because symbolic protest, a march, is really a statement of saying a lot of us disagree with this policy. Very helpful to support the civic folks inside, very helpful to support the protecting people, but it's not actually sufficient to displace an authoritarian who's entrenched. Because in a democracy, a march matters because in a democracy, you care what the people think because they will vote, they will influence, et cetera, et cetera. But as you move further and further away from that ideal, that vision, then it actually becomes less about that and becomes more about power, a power struggle. And so the tactics shift to being more and more about noncompliance to make the country ungovernable, which is a place where I think we may end up having to push in order to push out an entrenched authoritarian. Again, that is my background, disrupt and disobey. But I'm moving myself actually in these times. I'm realizing I'm becoming more excited about my own role that I want to play of building alternatives. And so this is the culture work this is the spiritual work, can sit in all of these, but often is central here. Building parallel institutions. So if you don't have a functioning government structure, maybe you'll need to get one. And so it may become a government in waiting gets created. It might become building alternative parties. It might become creating visions that are beyond sort of left-right divides, ones that are more cohesive to the times. Culture building, healing circles, different kinds of alternative community building. How do we get out of the electoral college? How do we, et cetera, et cetera. So that world of building alternatives. So I want to actually just like pause here just for a second and invite folks just to, in the chat, to just kind of note, like, is there one of these that's more like you, one of these that you find yourself more attracted to? And just to like paste in the chat, sort of, what are you drawn towards? Are you more protecting people? And what does that look like for you? Are you more drawn towards disrupt and disobey, or are you more drawn towards defending civic institutions? And on and on. So I just want to invite you, and I'm going to throw this up so you can see these 4 different pathways. But just to think about which one's the one that you're personally more drawn to. And so John's just writing in building alternatives as the one that they're doing. And so I love that people are just chiming in on the ones that they're kind of seeing, that they're seeing towards themselves. And I'm noting a lot of protecting people, which I think is, again, like I mentioned, faith traditions have often played a lot of that immediate role. And so, Barbara, I see you as a disrupt person. I see my disrupt people out there. So as people are continuing to kind of put in chat which ones they're leaning towards or kind of feeling pulled towards, I want to say 2 things, which is, one, there's going to be a challenge for all of you who are in protect people, especially, which is those of you who are protecting folks, there's going to be a big amount of protection this time. There's a lot of people to support. And there's going to be a challenge, which is that certain moments will have to expose people to risk in order to unseat regimes. That is, at some moments, there may be calls from this disrupt and disobey people to, it's the moment to head into the streets. So New Sanctuary Movement is working with people who are really scared to even go outside. And yet there may be moments when they'll have to tell their people, it's now the moment. We all have to go into the streets en masse and do a mass strike or a mass something and so forth. And as those tactics unfold, we may have to become part of that. So I mentioned that because I do see a lot of protect people here, and that's a piece that is often tricky later as it goes on. The second is that it's really important for us to be able to play that role and to be in touch with some people from those other roles. And one of the encouragements I've been making for people, because we do live in a culture that's very judgmental, one of the things I've been encouraging people to do is to very conscientiously make sure to outreach to someone in some different roles, to appreciate them doing those roles, to stay in touch with them, to stay supportive of them. Because I can't do all of the roles, you can't do all the roles, and having a wider view of what's needed gets us out of one of the things that I've seen us doing, which is being sort of beating up on one person or another based on you need to do my role. You need to do it this way. This is the thing that matters the most. And in fact, all of these things will need to be done. We'll need a mix of all of these at different times. So another piece here is do not obey in advance. And this was earlier on, and so I was writing or trying to encourage as much as possible for people to note this dynamic. Timothy Snyder was the person who sort of coined this phrase, where he studied people under authoritarians, and he said most power to authoritarian is freely given. It is not taken by force. It's freely given by people thinking to themselves, what will the authoritarian want? And then I give it to them. And so in that way, I will just cede the ground very quickly. And we've seen tons of examples of that. I don't need to mention all of them. There's just many of them. The NFL getting rid of end racism in the end zones, which was the thing that they had picked up in the last couple of years. It's a seeding. There's many examples of it, of the seeding. But for each of us to identify what are the areas that we might start seeding. Again, getting smaller, that constriction. And I marked something here, which is even folks who have noticed, like, who are seeding, like there's an organization I've been chatting with, and they've realized they've had to rewrite all of their curricula to be, they've tried to shift out of DEI in their framing that they're going for. Same values, but just different framing. And what we talked about was, they said, like, we realize we're doing some of that. And the encouragement I made them to do is, what are some other ways that you can signal expansion that actually is pushing up against some of those things, some of those values that you care about, and standing on them with principle? And I hear you, Barbara, saying it seems like everyone is seeding. It does seem like that, but actually there's quite a lot of people who are also not ceding ground. And so I want to point out, actually, yes, there's a lot of seeding, and there's a tremendous amount of not seeding. And in fact, one of the more interesting dynamics is the number of people who are not seeding, who are pushing back, who don't get their story out. So the stories of non-cooperation, the stories of people who are continuing to push, the stories of the USDA Inspector General refusing to get, when she got fired, she said, no, it's not a legal firing. I will stay in here until you pull me out. And so then she was pulled out. But that is an example of not seeding. And there's been many stories of those. And so one of the things, actually, that we can do inside the movement, inside ourselves, is to tell the stories of not seeding more often than we tell the stories of seeding. That's actually an example of us seeding. And so echoing out the stories of other people who are not seeding. So the Fed workers have been phenomenal. The fact that Trump administration hoped for 220,000 resignations. That was their goal. Their goal is 220,000 resignations. Their latest number is 20,000, many of whom are retired, who are just planning on retiring anyways. So that's an example of not ceding the ground. Or another example, just the number of people who are out in the streets just in this last week who've refused to stay quiet or keep their voices quiet. The fact that the Senate has now found the Democratic senators have found their voice and are now now filibustering to attempt to slow down this process. So these are all examples and stories for us to share, because if we tell the stories of seeding more than we tell the stories of not seeding, then it becomes the dynamic. And so, Susanna's pointing out a fantastic dynamic, which is a lot of stories of non-cooperation aren't told because we don't want to expose the people who are involved with it. And I think that's exactly right. And so you're even doing a good example of it, which is we don't tell the whole story, but just you're saying it. ICE raided a college and the professor hid some of the target students in a closet. So these are great stories to tell each other. These are the behaviors for us to do in these times. The other piece, this seventh step here that I said here, is to reorient your political map. It's a phenomenal time there's a lot of agitation shifting. And inside of myself, I think about politics a lot. I think about social change a lot. And yet I found myself in this time really shaken. What do I most believe? Who do I most identify with? Just between you and me, I've had a lot more questions of, am I a leftist? Is that how I want to identify in this times? Because actually, I want to step out of the left-right thing and kind of be more human in a way. This is me kind of sorting. And I imagine you may have other parts of yourself that are also sorting in these times. It's a upheaval. And so I don't know where I'm landing. I don't know where any of us are landing, but it does mean that there's a way in which we have to reorient our political map. One way that I've noticed a lot of people reorienting their political map is realizing that there has been an assumption that I think a lot of folks have had that the US is on a consistent trajectory to become more and more freedoms for more people. And that has been severely interrupted. Not all of us have that. Uh, I- Many of you know my dad, and I think he would have a much more sophisticated analysis on history comes and goes. It comes in waves. And it's about how much we pressure and how much we move and how much the movements push. But there's always backlash. There's always been backlash. And one way that I've uh, struggled has been the amount of open cruelty, the enjoyment of watching people suffer, and the made for TV ICE raids to watch people who are having their lives uprooted merely because they wanted to have better for their lives, for their families, and to then relish in people then getting their comeuppance. And that energy out there has been deeply destabilizing to me. I think I had hoped that there was less of that, and it's out in a way that has been shocking for me. And so I'm in this midst of upheaval. So one aspect of reorienting our political map is to pick up these pieces that we're wrestling with and wrestle with them, because some of how we analyze the world is not accurate anymore. Some of the ways that we are shifting, some of the ways that we imagined the US to be are not accurate. This has been a very racist country for a very long time. And so it's not surprising for those of us who have been experienced its racism to see its racism expressed this way. This is a country that just not that long ago, with regularity, would have lynch mobs, and people would come and celebrate. It was a time for people to celebrate cruelty. And so this is a moment for us to, if we have not absorbed that reality, that there's great cruelty, and in fact, that there's parts of the psyche in this country that celebrates that's celebrating the withdrawal from US aid so that people in Africa are not getting HIV funding, et cetera, et cetera. So the backlash, so a chance for reorienting. And another aspect of it is who our allies are. I don't know how you are politically. I've never considered OMB a political ally. I didn't even know who OMB was up until the last couple of months. But now I know a lot about OMB and what they do. And I think the people in OMB are now political allies, the folks who are resisting all of the pressures on them, and the workers that are inside. So it's just a moment of reorientation. And I think allowing that to be, and allowing one aspect of that to be what is OMB? Thank you, Donna. So OMB is the body who has been performing all of these personnel orders from the presidency. So it's the Office of Management and Budget. And so it's essentially kind of it's within the executive office of the President of the United States, but it's the body that sort of orchestrates budgeting processes and who gets what and where. So there's just so many different allies that we may not have considered or been part of or been connected to. And another aspect of it is it means we really do have to be very gentle with people who are attempting to reorient their own political maps. And I'll just give one example, which was, this is just me being very transparent. When I saw Trump make his announcement around Gaza, this sort of offhanded, he had no plan, it's this massive chaos. But this proposal that what he wanted to do was to take over Gaza and kick out all the Palestinians there. And I had a moment, not proud of it, but I had a moment where I then got judgmental of anybody who had supported Trump in the name of Palestinian rights and in the name of the Palestinian people. And I just had such a strong visceral reaction. And I had to call my friend to just get it out and say, I'm struggling with this thing. But reorienting my political map means there are many people I need to call in as allies. And so when Otpor, who's in Serbia, is an organization they were involved in overthrowing Milosevic, and they had this saying that they would say over and over and over again to everybody, which is, you'll have a chance to join us. And so when the police beat them up in the streets, they would say to the police who had just beat them up, don't worry, you're going to have a chance to join us. And when they got tossed in prisons, they would say to the prison guards, don't worry, you're going to have a chance to join us. And that was an attitude that they would hold over and over and over and over again. And what's so beneficial about that is it is setting a tone and an attitude that isn't an exclusive one where we're trying to get people to align with our political map. And so we all have to be in agreement right now, but is marking the arc and also stating the statement of inclusivity, that we are the group that wants to be the most inclusive possible. And so this is a great moment to reset culture for those of us who are living in a culture that's been exclusive, to reset that culture, to say, this is the moment in which you will get a lot of opportunities to join us. And so for Otpor, that really paid off because they targeted, I'll digress here to talk about them targeting. They targeted very intentionally the police and the military. So when the police, for example, would beat them up, they would often go to their homes with pictures of the people who had been beaten up, and often the people who had been beaten up. And they would stand outside and they would say, this person, this police officer is beating up kids. And they would say again their message, but don't worry, you will have a chance to join us in the future. And they did this again and again and again. And just they escalated. And so with some of the worst police who were relishing beating people up, they would escalate and they would go to their neighbors, to the neighbors of the police officers. And again, with these signs and these posters and the statement saying, you need to get your neighbor in line because he's going to have a chance to join us, but he's not there yet. He's still doing these awful things. They would go to the police officers. This is where I get squeamish, but this is what they did. They would, even on some of the worst of them, they would then go to the police officers' children's schools with these pictures of what the police officer had done. And they would say to the kids, this is what your dad is up to. Don't worry, he will have a chance to join us, but this is what he's up to right now. You need to get him in line. And so these are examples of what it looks like to systematically remove pillars of support, to change some of to get people into non-cooperation by both being oppositional. It's a very oppositional move, and it's also invitational. And so here we lead into really getting real about power. So autocracies do not move quickly. Autocracies do not move because of requests. They do not move because the political will is sort of communicated. They do not move because of a high polling percentage, 80% of people don't approve of them. They typically get removed because social movements have defining moments where they push them out. And so autocracies, and here I'm talking about entrenched autocracies, they don't typically get voted out because they typically start to steal elections. And so whether or not we're in that situation, it's not clear. Are we in a situation where Trump wouldn't allow a clean election? We don't know those things yet, but I think we need to get geared up for that possibility. And so what that looks like, I'll just continue the Otpor story. What they did in Otpor in Serbia was they began putting pressure, and eventually Milosevic said, yes, we have to run elections. And so he ran an election and declared himself that he won. And they had set up their own parallel institution that would track counting of ballots. And it was supported by international folks. The Carter Center and others were part of it. And they showed that it was absolutely not true, that in fact, he had not won. But what do you do with someone who is not willing to abide by the norms, the rules, the laws, who's willing to just continuously break them? And that became a point in which you're talking about you need to have an analysis of power. So a couple things. So typically when we think about power, we think about someone at the top has authority and they delegate it downwards. And I tell you to do something, and then you, and you, and you, and you. And that's one way of viewing power. It's not a great way of viewing power because it's not very accurate. Another way of looking at it is consent theory. The consent theory of power is nothing happens without consent from people to go along with it. The reason that things happen is because people do them. Donald Trump doesn't do anything. He doesn't build roads. He doesn't build bridges. He doesn't deport people. He doesn't arrest folks. He doesn't print money. He doesn't, none of the functions, none of the things. These are people who do all these things. And we do them because of giving our consent for some reason or another, because we want money, because we don't want to be repressed, because any number of different things. But at the end of the day, it means that the implementation of repression cannot happen without a bunch of different institutions. You can't have an order from Trump to do something where he says, I'm going to order the police to do it if the police are unwilling. He can't get what are different policies? He can't get a policy of implementing well, the wild, ridiculous policy of taking over Gaza, not luckily. He's not able to do that without a lot of different people participating in it. And not just, I mean, we think often just about the orders that get made, but all the many people, the workers that would be involved in implementing it, the workers who support it, the family members who support them, and on and on and on, the priests who then, give them community. It's a big group of people who are then sort of in that. So the way that non-cooperation works is when people say no, regimes can fall. I'll give you a story I'll give you a Quaker story, since I'm identifying as Quaker now. I'm now holding this identity. I'll give you a story about Quakers. So there's a period of time in which the U.S. government was supportive of a dictator. This will be a shock to all of you. The U.S. was supporting a dictator called Yahya Khan in East Pakistan, Bangladesh, what we now call Bangladesh. And brutal dictator, killed hundreds of thousands of people, was involved in just awful things. And there had been a kind of international sort of gentleman's agreement to not keep giving money to, but the U.S. continued to arm and send arms. So a group of Quakers heard about this and said, no, we're not going to support this. And so what they did as their intervention was they said, we're going to block the arms shipments. Ships that deport out of Philadelphia port and deport out of Baltimore and New York City, all along the East Coast. And so they said, we're just going to block them with canoes. We're going to set up a blockade. So they began doing these practice naval maneuvers. They had 30 days of practice just to go get media attention. But every day they began having, each of those 30 days, they had like a women's day and a men's day and they had a faith leaders day. To you guys, they had a faith leaders day, and then they had a faith clergy day. And so anyways, they had, a variety of different days to kind of do it. And then finally on day 31, when one of the shipments was planned to arrive, they jumped in the waters and they blocked the shipment. What do you think expect happened, which is the Coast Guard came and pulled them all out. And they said, okay, well, we didn't win this time. Ship came in, docked, and got the shipments and moved on. But they said, we'll do it again. And so they did it again, and they did it again. They did it in Baltimore, they did it in Philadelphia. And they did, as Quakers do, they hung out in bars where the longshoremen were. And so the international longshoremen, I don't know if you ever met any of them, big, hulking, huge guys, almost all guys. And they load all the shipments. That's what they do for a living. And one of them at one point pointed out this guy, Bill Moyer, and said, Bill, like, I didn't know Bill. He said, I've seen you on TV. Like, you're the ones that we've seen on the dock, like jumping in the waters and like doing this incredibly stupid thing, stupidly risky. And so Bill, along with other Quakers, began explaining what they were doing and why. They had a bunch of conversations, and eventually the longshoremen became persuaded in Philadelphia and said, look, if you set up a picket line, we won't cross it. So, easy tactic. The next time there's a shipment, Quakers set up a picket line, the longshoremen didn't cross it. So the boat changed its direction and moved from Philadelphia to Baltimore. So they ran down to Baltimore as fast as they could, and they tried to set up another picket line. This became a cat and mouse experience now, where the ships were now having to deal with the fact that longshoremen were refusing. This continued until the longshoremen, after several months of this, the longshoremen made a national agreement that they wouldn't load any of the armed shipments over to East Pakistan anymore. It then became so expensive that the government was no longer willing. And in fact, this became one of the major contributions for the US making a change in foreign policy. So I tell that story because it's a reminder about the power of faith leaders. It's a reminder about what happens when we're true to our faith and implementing it. And in fact, not just acting it by a statement of saying we believe they shouldn't, but actually getting in the way of the system, getting in the gears of it. Did the Quakers know that the longshoremen would agree to that? Absolutely not. They took it on faith. We're going to take the next step in front of us. And so that's also about handling our fear. And so we're heading into the last two here, and number 9 is about handling our fear. I know inside myself I have not had so much persistent ongoing fears inside of myself, navigating fears of what might happen, fears of what happens to my family, fears of my daughter, fears of her future, fears about the friends, the fears about the people in my life who are undocumented, the fears of my friends who have lost their jobs already, the fears of my friends, etc. Fear. We have to work with that. And fear isn't about repressing. It's not about putting it down. It's not about just moving on. But fear is about giving ourselves the space to deal with it and also constantly redirecting it. I've been telling stories of Otpor, and so I'll just keep going with them for the moment, which is they did a lot of humor. They created a lot of humor. When they were told that they were terrorists and that the administration, the Milosevic, would begin cracking down on terrorists, they had a terrorist fashion show. And so they had, pick Meg, they had Meg get up on stage and she would stand up and they said, look at her, she's clearly a terrorist. She's got glasses and clearly a reader, clearly someone who's a terrorist, and on and on and on like that. And they poked fun. That was their way of handling their fear. They had a joke that they used to tell each other. They said, look, when they're getting beaten up by the police, they said, look, it doesn't hurt. It doesn't hurt if you don't have fear. No, wait, how did they say it? What did they say? It doesn't hurt if you're not scared. And so it was bravado. It wasn't a factual thing. It hurt no matter what. But they were telling themselves a story about we're not going to be a fearful people. When 150 people got beaten up on one day, their response was, this will only rebound on them. More people will see the violence in this system. And so rather than in the spirit of King, who saw that unearned violence is redemptive, instead of shrinking in the face of it, it was rebounding. And the last one here is envisioning a positive future. And so what we put into the universe, what we see, I'm so pleased, in fact, and I'm so appreciative that many of you talked about alternative institutions as one of the things that you want to offer, because this is a moment in which if there's not a vision of what we're fighting for, if we're merely trying to go back to whatever we had just a couple of months ago, if that's all the vision that we have to offer, it's not going to work. It's not going to be sufficient. We're going to need to move forward, and we're going to need to have a bigger vision about what that looks like. And in some ways, that means each one of us will need to contribute to it. Each one of us will need to believe in a greater vision. Each one of us will need to contribute to that. Each one of us will need to articulate that and bring other people into that vision. It also means that we'll need some people who are especially thinking about how that relates to policy, how that relates to how do we bring folks who are currently stuck in a cycle of cruelty back into the fold? How do we work with people? All of those pieces need to be entertained, but we need to have a vision of doing that. And so while some of us might be just in motion, stopping all the bad things we can, it won't be sufficient on its own to just stop the bad, because there will be a power vacuum if we are successful, and we'll have to then return to what's the next thing. So another role that each of us gets to play is starting to envision what the positive future is that we have to offer. So I'm going to stop here. We're going to move into, I think, some announcements. Another piece. I've gone a little bit longer here. Sorry for that. but I just want to like affirm we're all in this together. We're all sorting this moment together. And so all of the pieces I'm trying to offer here are the pieces from my vantage point that make sense to me. And I'm aware that there's many more out there and many pieces that we don't know and we're going to figure out together. And I don't have certainty about the future. I've never been built with the kind of person who like believes it'll definitely get better or definitely get worse or any of that. I think I just believe the thing in front of us is to do the right thing, for each of us to find, again, the voice of God and to hear what's the message for us to do and to be faithful and do the next thing. So I think I'm turning over to you, Heidi, from here.
Yes, thank you so much, Daniel. And boy, am I glad that we are recording this, because there's so much that I'm going to have to go back and re-listen to and take in. But we're just so incredibly grateful. I'm going to hand it back to Jack for some Q&A, and then we'll close the evening with Bob in prayer after that.
Great. Thanks, Heidi, very much. Let me just first answer a quick question. One of the questions in the chat was, would it be possible to get a recording of this presentation? The answer is yes. There'll be a follow-up email. It will include a recording. And yes, you are encouraged to share it as broadly as you like. So please feel free to use that and watch it again. Daniel, a question. Bob writes me and says, in so many words, gosh, in the course of the last hour, I feel like I'm being asked to take risks I've never considered taking in my life. How do I prep myself for that kind of risk?
You got to get your people.
Yeah.
My friend George Lakey, who's my mentor, 87 years old, he did a major body of work that was going to risk his life. And so it involved going overseas to be an unarmed bodyguard to people who were under threat and to effectively be a nonviolent, the person who would answer the paramilitary's door to try to stop them from killing this human rights lawyer. So he did not do it alone. He's a Quaker, and so he had a clearness committee, and the clearness committee meeting included him having the question, so what happens to my kids if I don't come back? And they said, we will take care of your kid. I've now upped the stakes even further from maybe what you had in your mind, but that one of us will make decisions. And I'm having my own conversation with my family of what am I willing to risk? And for every one of us, I've set the bar here, and every one of us will figure out what are the decisions that we want to make. How do we want to support? And so the answer to that, I think, primarily lies in getting with some other people, because what I found is when I think about, like, if I think about going and doing action in the streets that might risk arrest by myself, I just can't. Even though I've done it before, I couldn't imagine doing it. I imagine it, and then it just seems so outlandish. But when I imagine doing it with comrades, with people who I trust, it gets a little bit easier. When I imagine what it means to dig in for the next many years, maybe earning very little income, or maybe, I mean, there's many different versions of risk other than just in streets, but earning a little income or spending all my time with folks who are, the poor and the disserviced and the folks who are getting targeted, or any number of different things, that in community gets a whole lot easier. So I think before I get lost in my own fear, I need to check with my people and pull them together. Help me assess.
Yeah. Daniel, I don't presume you're the encyclopedia for everything happening in the country, but one of the questions is, could you just name a couple of national groups that you admire that people can connect with, sort of for, if you will, a kind of steps forward, steps into any one of these categories of protecting, defending, disrupting, or building alternatives that you mentioned in your talk?
Yeah, we made a thing called looking forward to do some actions to stop authoritarianism. I'll paste that into the chat. Because we wanted to identify this question of like, what are some of the different ways that we can imagine? This was before Trump unfolded, so we made it sort of right before Trump was in motion, so we know a little bit more about what groups have great plans. So this is, if you're just looking for some places, and it's ordered by these 4 categories, but some different suggestions points that are categorized by easier to do, medium to do, harder to do. A couple of groups that I'm really appreciating these days has been, for defending civic institutions, has been lawyers. Democracy Forward has been a fantastic organization. And many of the lawsuits that have been successful, the ones who, they were the first ones out to sue to freeze the federal ban. Another organization that's in the in that category and a little bit of disrupting is Indivisible, which has a fantastic guidebook for those of you who are interested in putting pressure on your legislators, wherever you are, whether you happen to be in a so-called blue or so-called red area. But they have a very thoughtful take and guide that they have. And they've been very much in that. Protecting people is often very local. And so on our website, at choosedemocracy.us, we have resources for like how to build your own mutual aid group, because that's been one formation that's very handy, whether you're supporting immigrants or trans folks or any number of different groupings. It actually can support the entire community, and be a structure for doing that, where we create our own support systems. And so we're not reliant as much on external forces, but instead this. So as opposed to a charity model, a self-resourcing that our community has a lot of what it needs, in fact, if we're better able to share it. And so that's another sort of practical way in. And I think a lot of the protection groups are often more local as opposed to kind of a national thing, because it depends on each locality. And then for alternative institution building, I know less about it. I need to learn more. So I don't have a good organization off the top of my head. Oh, I do love participatory budgeting. And there's a group called the Participatory Budgeting Project, where what they've been trying to get people into, their analysis, sorry, this is too long, but their analysis is a reason why people don't understand democracy is because democracy rests on 3 pillars: education, representation, and participation. And what we have is we have a system that really emphasizes representation. You're represented by someone, but we don't learn how to read budgets. We don't learn how to make proposals about where do we want our money to go. We don't actually have direct control over that. And so participatory budgeting is an idea that emerged out of Latin America, out of Brazil, where you can directly allocate where money goes in your community. And as a result, people learn about budgeting. They learn about what their community wants. People want different things, et cetera, et cetera. It's a great way of alternative institution. Education, representation, and participation.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Heidi, I'm looking at the time. I'm wondering if you saw any questions that we really have to take, or if we can move into prayer.
I think it's a good time to move in prayer. I know there's a lot of folks who had questions on some kind of pretty specific locale. Can you make some recommendation things? But I think it means it's a good opportunity for us to continue conversation and informs us as Just Faith, where folks are looking for resources as well. So thank you all for your questions. And Daniel, if people want to follow up afterwards, the best way to get in touch with you or with Choose Democracy is?
ChooseDemocracy.us. It's a great way to just track us down.
Yeah, and we will send that all to you in the follow-up email, all the links and socials to follow.
Great. And let me invite everybody online right now with your camera on. If we could give Daniel a round of applause with our silent clap. Thank you, Daniel. It's been outstanding. We so appreciate your time.
Thank you.
And now it's my pleasure to turn to our closing prayer over to Daniel's father, Bob.
Thank you, Daniel. That was great. Shall we pray? Dear God, we come to you with lots on our hearts and minds. We see an enormous obstacle in our way, dear God, and yet you're the one who gives us wisdom. And we do ask for that prayer, dear God, that you help us to know which direction to go. Dear God, give us a sense of our inner being and the strength of it. Help us to be strong in our convictions. And dear God, give us communities to help us sort out all of the conflicts and questions and confusions in our hearts. Dear God, we ask that you would bring us people who will help us, people that will challenge us, people that will walk with us, people that care about us and love us, appreciate our gifts, dear God, and what we have to offer to this tremendous battle that is before us. And dear God, we do pray for those who are yet to see what is happening in this country. Dear God, I am particularly concerned about the Christian nationalists, some of them former and current friends of mine, dear God, who are just chasing something else and are blinded by what is going on. Dear God, remove the fog from their eyes and give us ways to help that process, dear God. Dear God, we ask for each one who's on this call, everyone whose purpose in their heart to do the right thing. Dear God, give them communities, give them strength, give them wisdom. Dear God, help them to know the difference between what they should act on and what they should let someone else do. And dear God, bring them into contact with people who are different from them, who are fighting in some other area of gifts. And show them, dear God, that we are all working together. Give us this great sense of community and a great cloud of witnesses who have gone before us, dear God. We think of those who have fought in the movements, Akpor, that's been mentioned tonight, the civil rights movement, dear God, the Indian rights movement, dear God, those in other countries. We think of the Gandhian movements. Dear God, help us to know and to have faith and to have a vision of the future. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Bob, and thank you all for being with us tonight. We look forward to seeing you next month. And until then, God bless. Take care.